everyone, welcome to the Combined Air Emissions Reporting webinar. My name is Kristen Durant with Ross Strategic, and I'm helping support the webinar today. Before I turn it over to our speakers, Marc Houyoux and Bryan Shaw, I'm going to go over a couple of quick logistics just to get us started. For today's webinar, you may have already noticed that everyone comes in muted, just given the high number of participants we have on today's webinar. Since you're in listen-only mode, if you have questions throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type them into your dashboard right here where it says questions. We'll let you queue those up throughout the webinar, so feel free to type in a question anytime you have one. We are, however, going to answer questions at the very end of the webinar. So we'll have a Q&A session once the presenters are done speaking. In addition to typing in your questions, we'll also have opportunities to unmute folks that would like to ask their question verbally. If you'd rather, because your question is a little complicated, if you'd rather actually ask your question, if you just type in, I have a question, I'll make sure to get you in the queue, and I'll let you know when I'm unmuting you when the time is available. In order for that to work, though, you will have to make sure you've entered your audio pin, which is right here on your dashboard. It won't be 72, that's my audio pin. Or if you're using mic and speakers on your computer, make sure that you're either using a headset or you know where the microphone is on your computer. If you have any questions from a technical perspective, like you can't get the question answered or you can't get something to work on the webinar, feel free to type those into and I'll answer those via the chat box as we go through the webinar. If your control panel, which is this right here, minimizes, which it does automatically, this little red arrow should show up either on the left or right side of your screen, and if you click it, it will both minimize and expand it. All right, now that we've gone through that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bryan Shaw.
Thank you, Kristen, for that. I appreciate everyone's attendance in the webinar today. I'm Bryan Shaw. I'm the chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And I'm here today serving as the state co-lead for the Combined Air Emissions Reporting Project. And so it's my pleasure to sort of go over some of the background, some of the goals primarily, and specifically I'm hoping to come away with beginning to answer why is this important and worth doing, what are some of the concerns that are out there that are in place, and what are the plans to address those. A part of this, I think, will also be having outreach such as this to invite input as we answer questions and concerns and frankly uncover new ones in this process. So I hope this will be helpful, and with that little bit of an intro, I'll begin. E-Enterprise to the Environment, as you're probably aware, is jointly governed by the states, the locals and tribes, and the EPA to collaboratively modernize business process. All that said is we're looking at trying to find a way to use technology to improve the environmental results, which certainly is important to all of us. But I think there's something for everyone, and specifically if you look at the second part of this bullet, to enhance the services to the regulated community and the public by making government more efficient and effective. Obviously that's kind of like mom and apple pie. Everyone should be able to get behind that. The key and part of the challenge is making sure that as we recognize the devil's in the details, to make sure that we indeed are able to meet those while minimizing the unintended consequences. As you may not be aware, the Combined Emissions Reporting Project arose out of two similar proposals in 2014 made by Arizona and the EPA, and so this is sort of an approach to try to get at answering see if I can get the system to advance for me. There we go. Trying to make sure that we find a way to modernize and move forward with addressing some of these issues. And I think as we will talk about in some detail further on, one of the challenges is making sure you know how to eat the elephant one bite at a time, and so part of the process has been to try to find ways to have those low-hanging fruit that we can take advantage of and move forward in a way that we have success and develop systems that can be expanded into other areas. And so the Combined Air Emissions Reporting Project focused on point sources, specifically the four major reporting programs you can see on your screen: the Toxic Release Inventory, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Compliance and Emissions Data Reporting Interface, and the National Emissions Inventory. And so part of what hopefully is obvious, and certainly to those that are working on the team, it's very obvious that each of these are different. They have a lot of similarities, but there's enough differences that makes it very critical. And those differences involve everything from the different pollutants that are involved based on the the type of program that's there. For example, the toxic release inventory is looking at much different pollutants than your greenhouse reporting requirements. And so that makes it a challenge in that it's not pulling from the single database, but actually pulling from several different reporting streams and trying to make sure that makes sense. What is somewhat less obvious until you get into the details is that you have different facility definitions oftentimes, whether you're looking at different data resolution, for example, at a facility level, or something that's smaller than the facility level, in making sure that whenever we're reporting and or looking at data from a particular facility, we understand what it really represents, and is it a part of, or is it the sum of everything going on at a larger facility, as well as the types, whether it's emissions and stack test data. And so there's a number of different components there that we have to work out to ensure that the data that's being reported is being used in a proper manner. And so these are similar programs that we deal with at the state and frankly with EPA, except that we're doing it piecemeal now. If we're going to make a combined approach to that, we have to make sure we consider those things up front, work out those differences, and make sure that we understand what each item means, represents, and where it comes from. And so different program development stages also affects that. Some of the key issues that we're dealing with, I would argue, are dealing with the different data flows, making sure, for example, when you look at the national emissions inventory that goes through the state, local, tribe component, that's much different, and states have challenges, needs, and concerns with regard to vetting that data and making sure that it's accurate and that we're able to continue using it for the things that we want. And so all those things are important to consider, and efforts are being made to try to make sure that happens. So with that little bit of background, sort of a high-level summary of where the CAER program is, the EPA and the state and local and tribal air agencies collect air emissions data for many separate programs. This is obvious. We collect it for different programs and for different uses. It was a diverse team that spent 3 months and had a 3-day event to try to develop what that future state, what sort of the ideal, where do we want to be going from here. And those participants were from EPA. There were 4 different programs that were covered, the ones that I just talked about, and then the states of Arizona and North Carolina. There was also representation from some of the regulated communities, specifically Alcoa, Phillips 66, and the Air Force. Back in June of last year, they did a return on investment analysis and indicated positive but uncertain savings. I think that sort of probably characterizes a number of our looking at our efforts at looking at this and analysis, is that we can see some positive, but it's difficult to quantify what that's going to be, as well as balance what are the potential unintended consequences, and how do we make sure we move forward in a way that's pragmatic. And then the short-term projects, short-term win projects, are ongoing. Those are sort of what I think of as the low-hanging fruit, trying to find those projects that are most likely to yield benefits with the least input, to help prove out some of the technologies, prove out some of the relationships, and provide for, I think, information and learning about how to identify what to look for opportunities, as well as what to be concerned about as we take on what may be more complex or less fruit that's not quite so close to the ground, although I would admit sometimes this low-hanging fruit doesn't seem that easy to access. Okay, some of the project goals. Reducing industry burden for point source reporting. I think this is one that makes a lot of sense. I think there's a way we can get there. Again, the key is we have to make sure that we have those principles in place, and specifically we'll see, I think there's some opportunity for reduction of duplication of reporting and have more of a one-stop shopping type approach there. Improve timeliness and transparency of data. I think this has the potential not only from the standpoint of making sure that we have the system working well, but it probably also helps us to iron out some kinks that may exist now that we're not aware of. Creating consistent information across the air emissions program. I think this will be somewhat helpful in that oftentimes there's confusion, and we'll see this as well, in what a facility name is and what those attributes are and what have you. And so I think by making sure that the data means what we think it means, we can both ensure that the reporting is done well, but we can also ensure that the way that data is used appropriately, that data is not mistakenly, it's not telling us something that it's not. And so I think this process can help to also improve the ability of ensuring that the information is properly used. Improving data quality, obviously, there are some obvious things that we can do by moving toward less transferring of data, less duplication of entry, and enter it one time, enter it correctly, and then take the human component out of introducing errors, hopefully from that point forward, as well as building in some of the QA/QC. Again, there's opportunities there, but challenges and concerns that have to be considered. And then improving accessibility and usability of the data, I think that sort of follows from the things we talked about before, and can support more timely decision making. Obviously, if we can get data through the process and accurate sooner, then we're more able to utilize that data. And one of the things I'm hopeful is we can avoid misuse of data by ensuring that it's gone through the proper QA/QC. The slide on your screen now sort of shows where we are today. This is sort of the process for each of these different programs. You can see they're sort of set up in columns, but you can see the facility in the top center of your screen would independently provide information about attributes and emissions to EPA for TRI, to EPA for the greenhouse gas reporting, and to EPA for the CEDRI reporting components there. And then you see that sort of alternative that's utilized for the National Emissions Inventory, where those attributes and emissions would go to the states, local, and tribes, and there would also then send in source test data, which the states would compile and send that to EPA, which would then go to publication. You can sort of see the siloed approach that's currently used for these programs, and then we'll look at what that future state, what it could look like going forward here in a moment. I do want to point out first some of the inefficiencies that we could potentially eliminate through this process. I mentioned before duplication and inconsistent facility information and facility matching, all those things, if we take care of those up front in this process, can hopefully minimize some of that. We can hopefully minimize or eliminate duplicative data entry and revision at the facility on those data elements that are included in several separate programs. So hopefully you could enter the data one time and it would be appropriately parsed out to the different programs. Some of the wait time due to this evaluation process may be able to be reduced. And then the National Emissions Inventory augmentation steps that EPA often goes through to augment the NEI, hopefully those can be either reduced or eliminated by identifying what are some of those causes and finding ways that we have input into and can hopefully preempt and have that taken care of up front, so we no longer have those issues with EPA augmenting NEI data from that standpoint. Could also, hopefully from the standpoint of some of the duplicative post-submission quality assurance QA, QC type things between EPA and the agencies. Again, opportunities, challenges, and concerns to make sure that's done right and that we don't sacrifice the ability to make sure data is appropriate and make sure that it's gone through that process before it's utilized in something it may be difficult to back out of. And then inconsistent emissions data across programs and associated work with that and the reconciliation there. These are some of the inefficiencies and eliminated opportunities for elimination and improvement of the process that I think warrant us looking at what's on the slide here, and that's sort of what's referred to as the 2B result, or what sort of that future could look like. And I'll point out a couple things I think are important just to make sure that we address where I think some of the concerns often come from and where some opportunities are for input and or improvement. The ideal as we're moving forward would be that the facility would have sort of two sets of data that they enter. They would, one, enter into the portal. They would enter in the attributes of their facility. That's the facility name, location, those kind of things. And then that would go to the shared facility attribute system, which would compile all that to make sure that everything is consistent and understands how that should then be sent out to the different programs. That then would feed right back into that portal to where when you make your emissions inventory, excuse me, your emissions entry from the facilities, that would happen at that same portal, hopefully be somewhat seamless, but that data entry would be done one time, and from there would be able to be distributed out to the different data programs for them to utilize. I think there's a couple of different areas I want to point out that folks from the states and some of the agencies I know are interested in. Certainly one that Texas is interested in is making sure that our investment in our programs and our systems that are working well, that they would continue to work well and interface with this program. And I think there's good news from that. I think if we do this well, states that have their own system should be able to maintain that. There's certainly a compatibility issue there. States that don't have their own system or don't have the system they want, this may be an opportunity for them to get that system, whether that's a system that someone such as Texas has or something that EPA develops. I'm not quite certain how that follows, but this being a voluntary program, and my hope is that as we move forward with this, that the portal, this could be, for example, the same portal you're using now. It could be that ideally you would have one portal you utilize, and again, it may be the portal you have now. I'd like to be able to say that if you like your portal, you can keep your portal, but that may be more politically charged than I should say. I'm hopeful, though, that if you have a portal that's working, that we'll find a way to make sure that we continue to be able to use that. So a couple other points I think this is pretty clear, but I want to make sure, because I think it's critical to understanding what the approach is doing. And that is, once this data is entered in the portal and it's properly paired up between the facility attributes and the emissions data, that then feeds into these different programs. Each of these different programs can pull off from that data what they need. The state, local, and tribe databases can pull from that. NEI, the CEDRI, the greenhouse gas, the TRI can pull that, and they can also feed back into where the previous emissions that have been reported go back into the emissions portal, so that you have that feedback loop, so you know what was reported previously. And I think part of where I'm excited to see input and direction and guidance is when we look at this shared data roles for QA/QC. An area that causes concern and what have you is making sure that we're able to properly vet data and ensure that it's vetted before it's utilized. I think there's a key opportunity there, and for those of you on this webinar, I think there's opportunity for you to help ensure that we've not missed, or that we don't miss going forward, some of those critical attributes or issues that need to be dealt with. But I assure you that that's something that's fresh on my mind and a number of other people's mind as well. And then obviously that then would, this combined database approach would allow for unified data access to the public. And I've said unified database. One of the things I probably should point out is this doesn't have to be owned by EPA. In fact, part of the goal is that this would be a shared access, so that the states, local, they could still own that data set. It just would interface seamlessly to where you don't necessarily have to have a big data storage room somewhere that EPA has control over. It just has to, we're just making sure that the data lines up and would be able to be communicated into this system flawlessly and seamlessly in a timely and accurate manner. Oops. Got happy with the trigger there. So some of the common concerns that I'll bring up, and again, we're continuing to work through these, but common question is, will EPA dictate how everything will change? No, this process is intended to be a project where we work together, so it's joint between EPA and the state, local, and tribal agencies working to make sure that we're addressing those issues. And the short time that I've been involved in this, I've been impressed with the openness that's there and the opportunity for input. And so I think if this fails to happen, it will be because of people not stepping up and asking questions or giving input, not because it was not welcomed. Have all the decisions been made? Again, no. We're reaching out to the agencies and industry to get input on this project to make sure it's done right. And I think it's key that we don't necessarily restart the process over and find another way that one of us might like better, or that some of us might like better, but instead to look at the progress that's been made and how do we capitalize on that, ensuring that we don't have issues that need to be done differently or that can't be addressed in the current structure. We can be somewhat flexible and agile in moving forward to make sure that we're addressing those issues. And so I think input is not only acceptable but encouraged and welcome. So I think by having more eyes look at this, we'll be able to, one, get a better sense of what things we may be missing, and two, more comfort in moving forward if we've done our homework correctly. Is this a single big data system that everyone uses? No, and I spoke to this a minute ago. The vision is for a connected network of those systems, so it allows ownership by the agencies or by different parties that are, the state, local, and tribal, who want to maintain that, but also supports if you need help and would, if state or local or tribe would like to be able to use a system, there may be opportunities I think that would be built into this that you could utilize the common system as well. So I think it can be the best of both worlds there. How will we avoid the pitfalls of past large projects? I think taking the sort of stepwise approach and one bite at a time, as I started off talking about, helps to make sure that we're addressing those opportunities that gets the most value for the least amount of input into that. And I think we get lots of feedback as we go along that'll help to make sure that we're on the right path. And so while certainly I don't want to suggest that there aren't concerns that are out there, I think that the process that we're in the middle of certainly provides opportunity for that input. And so I'm comforted looking at the transparency that's there and the opportunity for us to work together on that. So having rifled through that, I'd like to turn it over to Marc Houyoux with the OAQPS Offices of Air. What is your division? Division of Air Quality Assessment?
Yes.
And so Marc, I'll turn it over to you and you can sort of take control from here.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. And yeah, I am Marc Houyoux. I am the lead for the National Emissions Inventory Program here in the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Just waiting for control to come over to me so I can move ahead.
Hey, Marc, are you going to share the amount of effort and what have you you're going to be putting in this project, or is that something that I'm getting ahead of the game on? February 1.
I'm happy to. Are you talking about the 6-month plan?
Yes, sir. I think that's interesting. And while we're getting you control, I would like to have the group understand what's happening there and the importance that EPA is putting behind this project.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good point, Brian. So that has been my role, the leader for the National Emissions Inventory Program, and I'm starting a little bit more than a week from now. I'm going to be doing a 6-month assignment that will focus on co-leading this project, but doing that more exclusively than I'm able to do now with the other responsibilities that I have. And so that is something that we worked out with the office and my boss, Chet Whalen, and we are then during that time having another person whose name is Joe Mangino shadow me and get up to speed on the various issues so that we have not just me involved, but ultimately Joe involved as well, to have a senior staff person who's dedicated to this project for the longer haul. So yes, EPA has committed quite a lot of resources to this, and we just think it's a very important and has the potential to be extremely successful and useful for the environmental community. Okay, so the next topic we wanted to, we went over in the beginning, or Brian went over in the beginning, is that we've done the return on investment analysis that was done last year, and I wanted to share with you some more information about that. So we were able to quantify quite a bit of the improvements that could be made with respect to full-time employee numbers at the state, local, and other air agencies and at EPA, and we also were able to quantify some of the time savings that we would expect by getting input from industry and the costs associated with various systems. So we were able to do some quantifiable analyses, and in doing that we learned that the burden reduction to industry would be in the millions of dollars per year after these changes have been made in terms of reduced back and forth and other time spent. Currently, we also were able to assess that there would be some costs at the air agencies, including the state, local, and tribal, and those would be accrued over about 5 years. And we are very optimistic that the EPA is now taking a new approach with IT development that's being encouraged through this e-enterprise initiative with EPA and the state, local, and tribal agencies, and that's this agile development process. And so we did not factor that in when we did the initial return on investment analysis, but we are expecting that our costs may be even lower and our timeline may be even shorter compared to the way we've done things in the past. So we're feeling very optimistic about this and are moving forward accordingly as resources are becoming available. So there were benefits in terms of reductions in full-time employees that are needed for the emissions work, allowing those folks to be able to do other things is the idea. And we also had a lot of unquantified benefits that were identifiable, but we just couldn't assign a numerical value to them, and they get at a lot of the objectives that we have for this project, including improved transparency and timeliness, data accessibility and consistency, and increased use of shared data services that are being developed as part of the e-enterprise in conjunction with state efforts. So after we presented the results of the return on investment analysis to the management committee for e-enterprise, we were encouraged to move ahead with some short-term wins and received some resources, relatively small amount of resources to do that. And the scoping team identified 5 projects that were voted on among the EPA and state members and local members who are part of that team. So the 5 projects are, there's a CAER implementation plan, short-term win, and I'm listing in parentheses there each of the It's two-letter state abbreviations for the states who are also involved in this project. And that project is seeking to develop a long-term schedule and a plan for how we're going to be implementing the Agile methods and moving forward on getting the actual implementation done and doing all the homework and all of the back and forth that needs to happen to make this a successful project. We also were able to, oh, and I see that it should say WebFire there. Fire should be in capital. We have done some improvements for searches in WebFire, or they're partially done, I should say, and that also, the project is also doing some consolidated exporting of the industry test data so that even in the absence of any next steps that we still hope to do, that information is more accessible and usable by all of the folks who have access to WebFire publicly. In addition, we have a data dictionary and harmonization project that's looking at the various codes and fields across multiple data systems, not just the 4 EPA data systems that we talked about earlier, but also some of the state systems. And the purpose of that is so that as we move forward with implementation, we can understand the different languages across data systems. And even though we just have the 3 states, ultimately we'll have to include more states, but this gets us started on that process. We also have a process code called source classification code, and we have not ever had a great way of sharing those with the world and requesting new codes, etc. That hasn't been very transparent. We are developing a web-based service to do that and provide those codes publicly in a systematic and modern way, and have a web-based way of getting new codes or requesting new codes. We also are working for the 2014 NEI process and future NEIs to identify and eliminate the root causes of why we're having to augment data coming in. Of course, one of the key reasons has to do with the hazardous air pollutants not being required by the air emissions reporting rule for the NEI. But even beyond that, there's a lot of augmentation that happens that causes confusion, and so we want to figure out how we can eliminate those things for the future. Whoops. So some of the things that we've done to date, OAQPS, states, the office, or OAP rather, and OEI, we all got together and we formed an implementation team that I mentioned earlier as part of the short-term win, and we're using this support that is available to us for eEnterprise from 18F, and that is to help us implement this Agile approach. These are folks who have broad expertise in this approach. We're not just winging it, we're getting experience from the experts. And recently, actually this week, we completed a 2-day workshop that is helping to, it had to help to identify issues and considered ways to narrow our initial focus, really starting to get at, well, what are some of those next short-term wins that we can be looking at, and how are we going to move forward with the implementation in a good way. The Office of Environmental Information is mapped, and EPA has mapped data dictionaries. So that project that I mentioned has actually been partly done, and we are working now with some of these states and with the diverse team across EPA to finalize the results. The WebFire updates are partly done, and so we were now supporting, almost able to support the searches and get this additional data access that will be necessary to have this project be successful. And we have found a lot of common ground on the last bullet with states to improve and reduce the augmentation of state data. There's a lot, as you might imagine, we don't have all the answers, as Bryan said earlier, so there's a lot of open issues. That spans everything from dealing with the attributes of the facility, everything about the facility, and how are we going to leverage existing systems, such as the FRS at EPA and state systems, to get a better way of managing facility information and sharing that. We still have to decide what is centrally maintained and what relies on appropriate external systems such as state systems, and how do we deal with this known issue that there are different regulatory and statutory definitions of a facility for different programs. We're still exploring what we mean by portal. There is something that's called the EPA portal, and that is a somewhat coincidental name. We're not exactly sure how that particular portal is going to work in terms of what we propose here, but we think there is a connection, and we're trying to understand and leverage that work that's been done. And we're trying to figure out how would what we do for this project interface with existing systems, including the states that are already doing a great job of getting the information electronically and managing that. With the idea of distributed and connected program databases, we have this concept of doing the low-hanging fruit first, and what are those things that we think we're going to have clear benefits from? How do we get those things done first, and what are the steps to get there? How do we minimize disruptions and expenses for existing systems? Doesn't necessarily make sense to work on the things that are already working pretty well. What are those things that we can do that will not have a lot of expense for things, but yet improve the status quo? We have to figure out the data ownership business rules for working in this new way. We are just beginning to start talking about those things on the implementation team, but there's a whole lot more to do. The idea of quality assurance being so important to everybody, but how can we work together to do that and still make things improved, and certainly at least as good as they are now. And then there's the issue of activity information that is very helpful to estimating emissions, but we have as confidential business information for some programs and not others. How do we make sure to respect the CBI concerns across all of the programs? So for this year and beyond, we have some next steps for the project. Of course, we're going to be completing the existing short-term wins, and one of the key things there that we expect people to want to know about is schedule. Well, that's still in development from the implementation team. And finishing up those other issues that I talked we've made progress on, but we need to wrap those up. Through this webinar and through future webinars and other ways, we're doing outreach and trying to collect input from wider audiences than we've yet reached out to. And then doing that to both identify new questions and work towards answering key questions that we have left. Getting all of that done will be useful to consider the implementation issues that we know are there, and we're trying to figure out how to best move forward. And then as the resources are identified, continuing forward in this stepwise, agile way. So we are ready for questions. I would just like to point out the last slide that will be available when we post things has a list of all of the participants. Maybe I'll briefly move to that. We have a long list of folks from EPA involved in all these different programs, other supporting roles, in particular at ECOS and elsewhere in EPA, and then a long list of state participants as well. So with that, I think we're ready to start taking questions. And Kristen, if you want to remind people, I guess, how we want them to proceed there.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions that have been typed in already. Mark, if you want to take a look at those. And while we're doing that, just want to remind folks they can type them in, or if they just want to ask them verbally, they can just type in, I have a question, and I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Okay.
So Mark, do you want to take, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm trying, just scrolling down here. Have a very small window I can see like one line of the question at a time.
Okay, so why don't I go ahead and, hey, Lynn, Adil, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name. Lynn, if you would like, I can actually unmute you to ask your question. Give me 1 second here, because your question is rather long, so bear with me. Lynn, you're unmuted now if you'd like to ask your question.
I see that she indicates she doesn't have a microphone.
Oh, hey, there we go.
I can read the question if you'd like, and we kind of go from there. She says, you say shared roles for QA/QC is a good thing, but how does that work since we currently do QA/QC on every item, every entry from our point sources before submitting to EPA, that it sounds like a huge pain trying to edit corrected data on EPA server when now EPA gets clean data. Also, have you figured out how many rules currently in effect will have to be revised to make this work? And how about just working on 2 or 3 databases at a time to make sure this works first? I'll start, and Mark, you can jump in as well. And that is, I think from my view, the QA/QC is and how it shares a good thing. I have some concerns in making sure that the process that we end up with at the end respects and it allows for both the EPA to do what they're doing from a QA/QC as well as the state's QA/QC programs being in place. And so I don't necessarily think that it means that there has to be sacrifices. I think that if there are sacrifices, we need to be clear about that and make sure that we know what we're giving and taking to be able to get there. So I think the key point that I wanted to make in that part of the presentation is that that's still very much an open question about how do we accomplish that, but recognizing that it's one of the critical components that we have to make sure that we don't have data that's being utilized before it's been through the proper vetting process.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, one assumption in the question is dealing with getting that the states would be responsible for correcting data on EPA's server. And yes, I agree that that would be a huge pain, but I don't think that would necessarily be a very responsive solution to the goals that we're looking at here. In principle, moving the quality corrections as far up the chain as possible, getting the data in right the first time, we would want to try to figure out how to do that even better than we're doing that today. I agree that in many cases we are getting good data coming in, at least to the NEI program, and I'm sure that's true of other programs as well. But it's not true that we get completely clean data. There's a lot of things that get identified through our process that clearly could have been identified earlier, or in some cases are outliers that are correct outliers, and we simply never get the information that somebody has already looked at it. And so improving that communication can be a step in the right direction so that we're not having to go back to the states, and the states aren't having to go back to the facility, that those outliers, however we want to define those, will be documented as we go so that we minimize the back and forth later on. As far as the part of the question about the rules, we know that if we start with changing rules to do this, that's not going to be a very effective approach. We are going to certainly identify as we go and decide on how we think this is going to work best, rule changes that will be needed. So we don't know that yet, because deciding those things is part of the information gathering process. But we do hope that there will be things that can be done that will be beneficial to everybody, even in the absence of rule changes. But certainly we're not planning on starting with changing rules before we've learned what we need about the efficiency. And then the suggestion to work on 2 or 3 databases at a time to make sure it works first. Absolutely, that's the idea of these stepwise approaches, and take things slow and make sure things are working before moving forward.
Great. Why don't we jump to the question from Michael Madsen? And I'll go ahead and read that for you guys. How will the combined air emissions reporting affect existing state emission reporting systems like SLEIS? Will sources need to report NEI emissions to SLEIS or directly to combined air emissions reporting? And I would just say we've had a few questions about acronyms, so to the extent that we can define some of those, that would probably be helpful.
Brian, I can take this unless you'd like to.
Let me, I guess, say that just from this standpoint, and that is, part of what we talked about, since that was on one of the slides that I was presenting, is that this may be the same portal that you're using now, and so it's possible that we can maintain it to where your state emission reporting system would be able to export the data directly into the system, and/or it may be that the data lives there. So I think that's still an open question, Mark, and I'd be happy to hear your comments on that. But I think the key there is to try to make sure that if systems are working, we have a way to be able to maintain that and not have to reinvent the wheel if you've already got a good wheel working in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Brian. I think that the SLICE system is actually being used by a number of states, and so this is going to be a common concern. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's an existing system that's a vendor-developed system that many states have adapted for their own needs. What we would hope, though, as we said earlier, in this concept of connecting the systems better, would be that to the extent we can create a way of communicating through SLICE to these other systems and portals, or however we're going to do it, we would work to leverage existing infrastructure to do that. And the nice thing about SLICE in particular is, since numerous states are using that, if we are able to figure out some solutions that integrate SLICE into the overall vision, then that actually is really beneficial to a lot of states.
Thank you. Before we jump into the next question, would you guys mind just talking quickly about who 18F is? There was a question about how they fit into all of this.
Sure. Maybe Ron Evans or somebody else would be a better spokesperson for that group.
Sure, Mark. Can you hear me? This is Ron Evans.
Yes.
Okay. 18F is a group at the GSA. It's the General Services Administration for the federal government. And what they are is a, if you will, an incubator group for the federal government, trying to go ahead and bring in modern day techniques for advancing programs. And so, for example, historically, EPA, in upgrading systems like emissions inventory, we would look at it using a classic approach where you would go ahead, develop your requirements document, hand it over to the IT people, and hope that a few years later they developed what you needed. One of the things that the 18F group is helping us with is trying to figure out how to break down projects into bite-sized pieces so that we can actually go ahead and come up with meaningful and useful components quickly, so that in fact that we start producing some of the solutions very rapidly and not waiting for the delivery of a massive system that usually doesn't work anymore.
Great, thanks, Ron. Why don't we go into read-a-base? On the data flow diagram, facilities only report into the main portal, not any state portals. Is that what is envisioned for this project?
And I think we may have, this is Brian, I think we may have touched on this some already, but I think that's still part of an ongoing question, but it's one that I've indicated that I hope will be maintained, that you may be able to continue to use that state portal, and you may not even notice anything is different. If the state portal can export directly into the system in a way that has the right formats and data, I think that would be ideal, so that you would be able to choose, states could be able to use that portal and then export it into the system. So I'm hopeful that that option remains. And Mark, I don't know if you have some more comments on that.
Yeah, the example I like to use is that what that diagram is intending to represent is not necessarily the experience for all facilities, but the experience for a facility or potentially a company, where if they're currently reporting in, say, that facility is reporting to Texas, and that we want their experience to be unified across all of the programs. Well, Texas doesn't have oversight of TRI, and so how would that work? Well, we can imagine technology solutions where something is created so that Texas and the TRI reporting approach can be connected, such that from the facility standpoint, things have been much more unified through this single Texas portal, but it's not necessarily the same portal that a different state, a different facility in a different state might see.
All right. Our next question is from Hollis Casillas, who actually, it seems like they may have not. Actually, let's go ahead and jump. to Steve, and I apologize, your last name, I don't want to butcher that. So how does this relate to the Central Data Exchange, or CDX?
So Brian, I'll start if that's okay. The CDX is a piece of technology and a way of reporting to EPA that is currently being used by the various programs that we are looking at. And so the CDX is expected to be part of the solution in some way. We're not exactly sure how, but the fact that some of these systems are already using CDX, and the fact that that program, the CDX program, develops a lot of these shared services that we're hoping to leverage, it will certainly be a component of what we think will be a component of the solution.
I think that's good. Thank you.
And Diane Spingler also has a question: is ICE's CAER going to be included in this project?
We have been in discussions with the folks who work on ICE's CAER to see how we can connect that system with what's going on here. And since they weren't identified as one of the 4 key programs to look at initially, we don't quite have as many answers there, but the data that is being provided through this centralized facility attribute or system connected set of systems, where we have the authoritative picture of that facility, that is certainly something that they're very interested in and wanting to leverage and benefit from as well. I don't know if anybody from HOWICA is available to address that, but if you are, let the coordinators know.
I think I'll go ahead and jump to Renee Dennison, if that's okay.
That's great.
Great. Renee, I've just unmuted you. Hopefully you'll be able to ask your question.
This is Rick Dalebout. Some years ago, we did an audit looking at CERA Title III, Section 313 data and TRI, and comparing it to our emissions inventory data to look at facilities that possibly should be reporting that aren't reporting. And what I observed is at the facility level, you will have, in some instances, in one database, grouping of plants together, and then in another database, listing them out separately. Also, in the CERA database, too, you will have reporting of pollutants in ranges, whereas in NEI, you don't have that. So how would you propose to resolve those issues?
I mean, these are somewhat detailed implementation issues. They're the types of questions that, you know, those in particular we're aware of, but haven't solved. So I've been criticized for not having all the answers, but we're sort of at the stage of this project that we are reaching out to find collaborators so that we can get these questions answered.
I guess too, you know, if you go back in history, each reporting requirement had an enacting statutory requirement. And each of those statutes had various thresholds for reporting too. So what a facility is in one database may not be what a facility is in another database. So my suggestion to you is, if I think you have a good idea in terms of, you know, companies would jump on the bandwagon to reduce the amount of reporting, but before you do anything, start with one state and try and map out reporting in one database to another. And then that will give you an idea of some of the issues that you're going to run into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The different facility definitions is definitely something we've done a lot of thinking about, and think we have a data model that will allow us to deal with that.
All right, our next question comes from Joshua Kloppus. How did you quantify the additional cost to SLT agencies for having to develop new systems, APIs, web services, or other connection protocols to transmit data in the system or between distributed databases?
So the scoping team had a large number of states involved who participated, and in addition, Arizona issued a survey to states to try to quantify their existing costs, which was also used. And so while we certainly didn't get an exact cost estimate for, from every state, and it's difficult to develop cost estimates when we're not exactly sure the changes that will be needed, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, that was a challenge of doing a return on investment analysis, and that is partly why there's a lot of uncertainty. But all that said, there was a positive range of potential benefits to these types of changes in the end, even including that uncertainty. But I think the short answer to your question is we got input from the states who were participating in the project at the time.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Kushal Som. Not all emission source types have emission factors in WebFire or AP42. Is there a way for users to post emission factors from source-specific stack testing or CEM's data to be used for calculating emissions?
So the part of the system that deals with collecting source test data is CEDRI, and that has other components along with it, the emissions reporting tool, or ERT, and WebFire. And the vision is that those systems collectively will do a couple of things. One, they will collect mandatory source testing that will happen and is a part of the Part 60 and Part 63 rules, or will be added to those rules over time. And it will also allow for voluntary submission of the test data that are available, provided that the required information inherent in the methodologies that have been developed to collect that information. And that includes things like using certain approaches and documenting certain things. Assuming that that is available, that information can be provided voluntarily as well as by regulation. And the vision is to take that information in and periodically be able to use it to assess whether emission factors need to be revised, if the decision is made to revise them, to use the routine notice and comment approach for proposing and ultimately finalizing, potentially finalizing new emission factors.
Great, thank you. Next question from Rita Bates. Are EI reporting requirements differ from EPA's requirements? How would these differences be accommodated?
Exactly. I mean, I've been doing a lot of the answering. You want to take this one, Brian?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think part of the beauty of trying to work through all this is also the challenge of working through all this, is that we have to come up with ways to ensure that what we're collecting for the state's purposes, what we're collecting for EPA purposes, line up and mesh. And I think sometimes that's going to likely highlight issues and areas where there's difference of opinion. It's also going to provide opportunities and challenges for us to find ways that we can supplement what we're requiring, and making sure that we can continue to use those for the different purposes we're using. Some of the concerns are, how do we go about doing that, if I'm collecting something for a state purpose that's in addition to what EPA needs, do I have to then create a separate database to maintain that so that the states have access to it, or do I have to create a separate database to make sure that others don't have access to something that we need to maintain, whether it's confidential business information type things or what have you? And so those are some of the issues that I'm still interested in how we're going to work through. I think we can accommodate those, but those are some of the challenges that I see, Mark. That's just a shotgun at that. You may want to supplement.
No, I agree. I mean, we have to identify these differences. I think there's a couple of cases. One where the state might be more extensive, and in that case, the state should be allowed to continue, to get what they need. And but if there is a case, and I'm not aware that there is, but if there were a case where the state's requirements were, less than what EPA required, but yet the state was still supposed to be reporting things to EPA, we would have some conversations about, how do we get out of the situation? And I don't know exactly how that would work, but we would want to be more in sync than we are now, and would have to work through that.
Judy Rand had some very similar questions. Judy, I'm going to try and unmute you so that you can follow up if you'd like to. You should be unmuted now.
Okay, thanks. Are you going to read my question, or did you want me to?
No, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, because you've got a couple questions that seem related, so I wanted you to be able to follow up.
Oh, well, my first question is, if the states require things like ozone season data, are we going to lose that data because you guys aren't going to ask for that?
No, we wouldn't. Like we were just talking about, we wouldn't recommend removing things that aren't just because they're not required by EPA. The goal is that all of the program's needs are met, but that the reporting is streamlined.
So you would ask for New Jersey specifically something that another state might not ask for?
Certainly. We wouldn't necessarily be the ones asking for it. I mean, each of the states need to be met for their various reporting requirements. Those regulations right now are coming through the states for the NACs, and we would assume that would continue to be the case. But where we're talking about the same release points and emission stacks and other things, there wouldn't be the need to report those repeatedly for multiple purposes, at least in concept.
Did that help? I think, Judy, part of the idea there is that if we as a state need more data or are collecting more data, this system would hopefully provide for the opportunity for that data to still be collected as it's been collected before, but only those data that are required to be reported to EPA would feed into the appropriate systems and programs that we're talking about. And so the goal would be to make sure we don't basically make your current system unworkable. In other words, you collect the data because you need that data. This process should not require you to not collect that data, nor should it require someone else to collect data just because you're collecting it, but instead would recognize that states have individual needs for data and would respect that. And part of the challenge would be working through how do we make sure that that's seamless and still maintains the data protections that are needed, but that states have access to that data as well.
Okay. And my second question was, the data that you're getting, are you considering that draft until such time that the state says, okay, we're done with our QA/QC?
I'll jump in and say that's one of the areas that I've sort of alluded to it multiple times as we go through this. I'm going to have keeping a close eye on making sure that we're taking the right precautions to ensure that data doesn't get utilized in a way that shouldn't be done if it's not been through the QA/QC process. So I'm still a little bit unclear as far as how we go about making certain that the QA/QCs occur, and that at what point do you do that editing and who all has access to edit and make those corrections, but ensuring that we don't have data that's out that's not been QA/QC'd that could be that could mislead someone or be used to mislead what an issue is. And so I think that's an issue that is not being swept under the rug. It's something that is front and center and is being dealt with. Mark, I don't know if you have some updates you can give on how that process might play out, but it's certainly a concern that we're looking into.
Sure. So we don't have, your specific question about would it be considered draft and how would it be treated and when does EPA get it and all those things are sort of part of these business rules that we've alluded to and indicated need to be resolved so we can proceed with implementation. And I would imagine that this particular question, or perhaps even a subset of this question, will get the individual attention of a specific group tasked with figuring out how that's going to work best. And that's where we'll have the opportunity for additional states to participate in those types of projects, or the ones that are already participating to inform those types of considerations and make sure we come up with a solution that works. And we also hope to involve industry in getting that type of feedback as well.
Great, thank you. We are at the top of the hour, so I just want to respect people's time. We have a number of questions that were not answered. Mark and Bryan, do you want to, we can send an email follow up with some of these questions, or do you want to continue answering questions as long as people want to stay on the line?
Well, I can say what we did for the previous webinar was we were able to answer those questions afterwards. And yep. I don't know if that's a possibility here. I can stay if need be.
Same here. If there's some that are relatively easy, we may be able to click off. I'm looking at some of the questions. I think we've addressed some of them.
Great. Why don't we keep going then? Because we've still got folks on the line. So if you, Bryan or Mark, do you want to pick your next question, or do you want me to pick it?
Let's see. There's some that may have already been addressed. So my list of what's been addressed may be different than yours. So maybe if you'll pick it, we can make sure that
got it. All right. How about we go with Hollis Casillas? How could activity be CBI for some programs but not others if CBI isn't CBI? Example, where might it affect one program and not another?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what has happened in certain contexts that programs have responded to a claim of CBI without addressing the legal question of whether it's CBI or not, and the program has responded by treating it as CBI, and those decisions haven't been made consistently across all the states. They haven't been made consistently across all of the EPA programs, and so that's what I'm talking about there. So we obviously, if programs have disagreements about what's CBI and what's not, and we're trying to do something consolidated, we need to figure those types of discrepancies out and figure out what to do.
Right, I agree.
All right, we have a question from Brian Knoll. It's a little bit long here. Of the 4 reporting programs included in eEnterprise, the information collected in CEDRI appears to be fundamentally different than the others. It is short-term and based on individual mission source. The data collected for the balance of the programs are longer-term and may be facility-wide. What is the benefit of collecting CEDRI data as part of this effort?
The main benefit is that is really on the facility attributes down to the process level. The sharing that common understanding of the facility across the programs will have enormous benefits, and it will allow we don't expect that the emissions would be the same, because as the question states, the CEDRI system is collecting short-term emission rates for compliance purposes. But that being said, there is this connection in that type of information is then built up and used to build emission factors in various ways that are then used to create emissions estimates. And our strong belief is having all of these pieces integrated will provide us a lot more opportunities to leverage that type of information for various purposes over time.
I'm good with that.
Great. We did have a couple questions that related to timelines, asking for more information on when industry might see first changes. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to that.
Well, we have the implementation team really starting off with getting that type of schedule down. So we have a goal of within 5 years making some significant progress, but as we've said many times, we want to see some early wins and get some improvements made sooner than that. And in terms of when that might start, affecting what the facility would see, I don't think we know that right now.
Great, thank you. It looks like some of these are related. How about, will state systems have to speak live to federal systems during reporting period while industry is entering data?
It's a great question. Hopefully that person can be on one of our work groups to help us figure out the key issues. But this one has come up before, and there is this concept that there will be live communication among systems. Whether that means state and federal are speaking live to each other, it's to be determined, but I think it's certainly possible. The facility attributes being transmitted to the federal database before the company has certified the data. I mean, that gets into exactly what are the business rules for what needs to happen. The goal is for quality information to be shared. So if the information isn't certified as quality, then I think in principle we would not want that to happen. But again, it's a detail that we haven't gotten answered. Do you have anything to add, Brian?
No, I just to reemphasize that those are some of the critical issues that have to be worked out to make sure that we find the most efficient way to do that data processing and uploading and getting it there, but not so quick that we circumvent some of the necessary requirements to make sure it's properly vetted before it's utilized. So I think it's an open question that still has to be dealt with. With technology where it is, there's probably lots of opportunities there, and it's like you said, it's feasible. It's just a question of whether or not it's appropriate and beneficial to have it live, and then you deal with, can multiple people be making changes simultaneously, and if so, how do you track that? And so I think it's an interesting challenge, but one that we're going to have to continue to grapple with.
Joshua also asked if Texas would be willing to share their experiences in matching facility IDs across different agency programs. And I think this is related. We've had a couple of questions on the facility ID.
Right, and I think we're one of the states that is working on that. So Mark, you may be able to speak better than I am. I know we've definitely had an interest in trying to share what we have, and I don't think there's been any challenge with us sharing that information at this point.
I'm still trying to figure out where that question is that you at. What was the person that sent the question again?
Joshua Kaufist?
Yep.
At 140.
Yeah,
okay, I see. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
All right. We have a question from Brian Fraser. How much is non-point and other categories other than large point planned to be integrated?
Right, so this project is focusing on point sources that are a part of one or more of the programs, and there's been a few questions that have come in about the NEI, which also includes what we call non-point sources, which are summed up at the county level and not characterized in any inventory as an individual source at a location or address. So I think the universe of facilities that will be included would be the universe, the macro set of all the facilities included in at least one of the 4 programs. That would probably be the ultimate goal. Initially, though, we might be, say, focusing on facilities that are in 2 or more of the programs, because that's where more benefit would be derived, or some other criteria for where we're going to focus. And so that gets at the process by which we'll be going through to identify the most important things to do first, the biggest bang for the buck.
And Joshua is still on the line, so I'm going to try to mute him because he had some follow-up. Joshua, are you able? Actually, it sounds like you might have your computer audio. So Joshua was just really keen on hearing more about Texas's experience with the cross-agency facility IDs, if you didn't mind speaking to that today. Otherwise, we can follow up with him after the call.
Yeah, great. And I may need to visit with staff some more to make sure that I'm accurate on where we are with that. I know that we've shared, and maybe it's primarily been with some of the reporting and the data as opposed to some of the facility IDs. I don't know of a reason that we can't share that. Obviously, we're interested in trying to make sure that we're all in this together and we find solutions that work. So maybe it's something I need to check with staff to make sure that I'm not promising something I can't deliver. But so long as it's legally allowed for us to share some of our experiences there, I think we're going to be willing to try to work with others to help make sure we move the ball down the field.
And Beth Graves from ECOS also rightly pointed out that we do have a facility IPT that is led by Kim Hoke in Missouri and Lee Kyle at EPA. And if folks want more information about that IPT, they're looking at this issue in particular. If you're interested in participating in that, I'm just going to have you email me. This is Kristen Durance. I'm the email address that you got all the webinar information from, and I can get you into contact with the right folks. We have a question from Tom Valilis. Do you expect a minimum number of states to join in before you move forward with implementing the enterprise system?
I'm going to interpret that as in a production sort of sense. I think the way I've been envisioning this moving forward, and Bryan may have a different input or perspective, is that because of the stepwise nature of what we're doing, we don't necessarily need to have a minimum number of states. In some ways, it would be advantageous to have a very small number to start, to be willing to experiment and work through some of the challenges early on so that other states can benefit from that. But I don't know that there's necessarily a minimum. I think that, you know, if we're able to even get this to work for one state, all of the industries in that state would benefit from that. And I think, assuming that there is benefit from it, then others would be even more inclined to join in.
And I don't disagree with that, Mark. I think, you know, part of the balance there is that the more states that are involved, sort of the more those costs are spread, and so you get more value for the buck that was spent and the time that was invested. But the flip side of that is what you related to, and that is, you know, when there's fewer that are starting initially, it makes it a little easier to manage the challenges that you're facing. And so I suspect it'll sort of be somewhat self-regulating. If we have fewer challenges and issues, there'll be more people that are wanting to come on board. If it's much more complex, then you're probably going to have fewer that are willing to test the water initially. And so, but I think long term, you hope that if this process works and we're able to protect the, you know, it remains voluntary, where this is something you participate in if it suits you, then we have we'll see that people will jump in to the extent that it adds value to where their situation is, and I think that's a good place to be.
We also had a couple of questions actually on workload for industry and how that might change. Will it spike because things have to be done at the same time, et cetera? Do you guys want to speak to that?
Yeah, we've actually gotten one of the biggest things that we heard from our initial focus groups and at the Lean event that we did is that that industry currently appreciates that the deadlines are not all at the same time. And right now, the GHG reporting program and TRI deadlines are a little bit earlier in the year than the state, generally speaking, than the state deadlines for NEI, and that allows their staff to be more efficient and effective in terms of only being able to deal with so much at one time and having to brief their management and up the chain on their results before they're submitted, et cetera. And so we've heard that, and that is certainly going to be factored in. Some of the benefits that we might see with this sort of system that would accrue to industry and also to the agencies has to do with the linking of the facility information. If a later piece of information comes in that's inconsistent with something that was submitted earlier on, then that can be flagged for the affected parties, both at the facility as they're submitting it, and if there's a reason for it and it gets submitted like that, then at the various agencies who could be notified of those types of discrepancies and make a decision about what to do. So, how all that might work, I don't know, but we've heard that as a concern from industry and I think that's going to get factored into our progress as we move forward.
Great. So Bryan and Marc, a number of the remaining questions are similar to questions that have already been asked, so I think we can probably call it good for today. I just want to do one more quick. If anybody has questions, feel free to just chime in and I can try to unmute you. All right, I'm not seeing anything pop up. So if you guys are ready to wrap up, I think we're good to go.
Okay,
I think we're good. I think hopefully this has been helpful and encourage people to engage in the process and provide some of the concerns they have. And thank you, Marc, for your work in putting this together. And I hope we all take advantage of this open and transparent process to make it where we can address those challenges where everyone's comfortable.
Yeah, and thank you, Bryan. We very much appreciate and value your support in this, and thanks to the contractors who've been supporting this as well.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for all of the questions. I really appreciate how active everyone was on the call. Please look for an email as a follow-up.
All right. Bye.